A West Virginia property was abandoned after something was found below. The flashlight beam cut through the thick, swirling dust of the root cellar, coming to rest on a heavy steel hatch that had no reason to be there. Thomas, an independent property appraiser contracted by a distant out-of-state trust, stood in the freezing dampness of the underground room and wiped away a layer of grime from the metal. The county blueprints in his leather satchel showed only a standard stone foundation for this isolated 1930s timber house in the dense Appalachian foothills. There was no mention of a subterranean extension, and certainly no record of the 4 massive, rust-pitted iron padlocks securing the hatch to the concrete floor. Something about the way the chains were wrapped suggested they were not meant to keep intruders out, but to keep the hatch firmly closed against whatever lay beneath it. The silence of the house above was heavy and absolute. It was late November of 2014, and the property sat at the end of a forgotten logging road off Highway 39, 20 miles from the nearest town. The previous owner, a retired structural engineer named Elias Vance, had died in a nursing home 3 months prior, leaving the 80-acre estate to a corporate trust. Thomas had spent the afternoon cataloging the main floors, noting the peeling wallpaper, the water damage in the ceiling, and the strange, obsessive way the windows had been boarded up from the inside. But it was here, in the windowless cellar, that the true nature of the property began to reveal itself. Kneeling on the cold floor, Thomas noticed a faint, rhythmic vibration traveling through the soles of his boots. It was incredibly subtle, like the distant rumble of a heavy freight train miles away, yet there were no train tracks anywhere in this part of the county. He placed his bare hand flat against the center of the steel hatch. The metal was unnervingly warm to the touch, a stark contrast to the near-freezing ambient temperature of the cellar. A thin wisp of foul-smelling air, reminiscent of ozone and old stagnant water, drifted up from the microscopic gap between the hatch and its housing. Thomas pulled his hand back, a cold prickle of unease washing over his shoulders. He returned the following morning shortly after 9 o'clock, carrying a heavy-duty battery-powered angle grinder and a crowbar. The morning fog was thick, clinging to the skeletal black trees surrounding the property and swallowing the sound of his truck door shutting. Down in the cellar, the air felt even more oppressive than the day before. The vibration was still there, steady and low, humming beneath the earth. Thomas set to work on the chains. The high-pitched scream of the grinder against the iron padlocks filled the small stone room, throwing bright showers of orange sparks into the shadows. It took nearly 40 minutes to cut through all 4 locks. When the final chain dropped to the concrete with a heavy, dead clatter, the cellar suddenly felt entirely too quiet. Thomas wedged the flat end of the crowbar under the lip of the hatch and leaned his weight backward. The metal shrieked as the rusted seal broke. A sudden, forceful exhalation of warm, dead air rushed out from the dark void below, carrying a smell so ancient and dense it made him gag. It smelled like wet copper, decaying limestone, and something faintly chemical, like antiseptic masking rot. He clicked his heavy tactical flashlight up to its highest setting and shined the beam down into the opening. The light did not hit a dirt floor or a simple root storage bin. It revealed a perfectly circular concrete shaft descending straight down into the earth, lined with heavy industrial steel rungs bolted into the gray walls. The shaft went down farther than his light could reach, disappearing into a haze of floating particulate matter. According to local property laws, an appraiser was only required to document accessible square footage, but an unrecorded subterranean structure could drastically alter the valuation or liability of the estate. Against his better judgment, Thomas secured his satchel, tested the first iron rung with his heavy boot, and began the descent. The air grew steadily warmer with each step down into the dark. He counted the rungs as he went: 20, 30, 40. The square of gray light from the cellar hatch grew smaller and smaller above him. By the time his boots finally struck a solid concrete floor, he had climbed down at least 60 feet beneath the West Virginia soil. The space at the bottom of the shaft was pitch black. Thomas swept his flashlight around, illuminating smooth, seamless poured concrete walls. He was standing in a small antechamber. To his left, a large electrical breaker box hung on the wall, its metal door hanging open. To his right, a heavy steel door stood slightly ajar. He moved toward the breaker box, noticing that the thick black cables leading out of it disappeared directly into the bedrock. With a gloved hand, he threw the massive main switch. Deep within the walls, a series of heavy mechanical clunks echoed, followed by the low electrical whine of large generators waking up. Row after row of caged fluorescent lights flickered to life overhead, casting a harsh, pale yellow glow down a long, impossibly wide corridor. Thomas stepped through the steel door and stopped, staring down the tunnel. The corridor stretched for at least 200 feet, driving straight into the subterranean heart of the mountain. It was wide enough to drive a small truck through. The sheer cost and logistical nightmare of excavating and pouring this much concrete in secret decades ago was unfathomable. Elias Vance could never have funded or built this alone. It was a military-grade installation hidden beneath a rotting wooden farmhouse. As Thomas walked slowly down the corridor, his footsteps echoing flatly against the walls, he noticed a series of identical metal doors lining the right side of the tunnel. He approached the first one, finding it unlocked. He pushed it open and shined his light inside, though the overhead fluorescence soon buzzed on. The room was not a storage closet or a utility space. It was set up exactly like a child's bedroom from the 1970s. There was a small wooden bed with a faded quilt, a dresser, and a small desk. But the unsettling details quickly became apparent. The furniture was bolted tightly to the floor, the walls were lined with thick, gray acoustic dampening foam, and high in the corner of the ceiling, a heavy glass dome housed a mechanical security camera, its lens pointed directly at the bed. Thomas backed out of the room, his breath catching in his throat. He checked the second door. It was an exact replica of a vintage kitchen, complete with a table, chairs, and old appliances. Again, everything was bolted to the concrete, the walls were soundproofed, and a camera watched from above. The appliances were completely gutted, the refrigerator had no motor, the oven had no heating elements, they were mere props. This was not a bunker designed to keep people safe from a nuclear attack. It was an observation facility. It was an enclosure designed to simulate a normal environment while closely monitoring whoever or whatever was kept inside. At the far end of the corridor, the tunnel opened up into a larger, circular command center. Banks of ancient, dusty electronic equipment sat dormant on long metal tables. Dust motes drifted lazily through the stale, warm air. In the center of the room sat a heavy steel desk with a single leather-bound logbook resting squarely on its surface. Thomas approached the desk, his heart hammering against his ribs. He opened the ledger. The pages were filled with meticulous, handwritten notes dating back to 1982. The early entries discussed structural integrity, seismic monitoring, and depth excavation. But as he turned the pages, jumping forward through the years, the tone of the writing shifted. An entry from October of 1997 read, "The localized tremors have increased in frequency. It is testing the eastern boundary of the enclosure. We have increased the concrete density by 3,000 pounds per square yard, but the audio sensors indicate it is still moving through the porous limestone." An entry from April of 2003 was written in a hurried, frantic scrawl. It read, "The mimicry behavior is worsening. It arranged the mock furniture to perfectly match the upstairs living room. It knows the layout of the house. We cannot let it reach the surface layer." Thomas felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. He looked up from the book. At the very back of the command center, set deep into the curved concrete wall, was a final door. It was different from the others. It was a massive, circular blast door resembling the entrance to a bank vault, complete with a heavy rotating locking wheel. Set at eye level in the center of the steel was a small, thick observation window made of layered quartz glass. The wheel was turned to the locked position, but the thick steel locking bolts were straining, slightly bent outward, as if something of unimaginable weight had been pressing against the door from the other side. Drawn by a morbid, terrifying curiosity, Thomas walked slowly toward the blast door. The ambient warmth in the room was coming entirely from the metal surface of this door. The vibration he had felt upstairs in the cellar was infinitely stronger here, thrumming up through his legs and rattling the teeth in his jaw. It was not a mechanical vibration. It felt organic. It felt like the slow, rhythmic breathing of something impossibly massive resting just behind the steel. He stepped up to the quartz glass window and peered through. At first, he saw only absolute blackness. It was a dark so complete it seemed to absorb the light from the room behind him. He pressed his face closer to the glass, cupping his hands around his eyes to block out the glare. As his eyes adjusted, he realized the blackness was not empty space. It was a physical surface pressed flush against the other side of the glass. It looked like dark, leathery skin covered in fine, ash-colored scales. As he watched, frozen in terror, the surface slowly slid downward, revealing a pale, milky expanse beneath it. It was an eye. An eye the size of a dinner plate, devoid of any pupil or iris, glowing faintly in the pitch black of the cavern beyond. The pale eye fixed entirely on Thomas. The deep, rhythmic vibration abruptly stopped. For a terrible, suspended second, the absolute silence of the underground facility was deafening. Then, a new sound began. It was a soft, wet tapping against the inside of the thick glass. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythm perfectly matched the frantic, terrified beating of Thomas's own heart. The massive blast door groaned, the steel hinges shrieking as the immense pressure on the other side suddenly increased. The bent locking bolts shifted forward another fraction of an inch, shedding a rain of rust flakes onto the concrete floor. Thomas broke away from the door, his mind entirely consumed by blind panic. He abandoned the logbook, abandoned his heavy flashlight on the desk, and ran. He sprinted back down the impossible corridor, his boots slipping on the dusty concrete, ignoring the empty observation rooms that now felt like open mouths waiting to swallow him. He reached the bottom of the shaft and threw himself at the ladder. He climbed with reckless, desperate speed, tearing the skin from his knuckles against the rusted iron rungs, not daring to look down into the dark he was leaving behind. The heat of the shaft seemed to rise with him, carrying the faint, terrible sound of bending steel echoing up from the depths. He hauled himself out of the cellar hole, his lungs burning, and slammed the heavy iron hatch shut behind him. He did not have the padlocks to secure it. He dragged heavy wooden crates, broken furniture, and a rusted anvil over the hatch, piling hundreds of pounds of debris over the metal before sprinting up the cellar stairs and out of the house. He threw his tools into the back of his truck, started the engine, and tore down the dirt logging road, sliding wildly around the curves until he finally hit the pavement of the highway. He did not stop driving until he was 3 counties away. Thomas never filed his official appraisal. He sent a brief, vague email to the out-of-state trust, citing severe structural hazards and toxic black mold, and refused to accept any payment for his time. According to county zoning records, the property was quietly seized by the state less than 2 weeks later under an obscure environmental protection mandate. No official explanation was ever released to the public. However, hunters and locals who frequent the deep woods along Highway 39 have whispered strange stories in the years since. They claim that shortly after the property was condemned, a convoy of unmarked heavy-duty cement trucks drove up the logging road in the dead of night. They poured thousands of gallons of concrete directly into the foundation of the old house, sealing whatever lay beneath it under a solid, impenetrable cap of stone. Yet, on still, windless nights in late autumn, residents living in the valleys miles away claim they can sometimes feel a low, rhythmic thrumming deep in the earth. A vibration that pauses, changes tempo, and slowly seems to learn the sleeping patterns of the towns resting above it. A missing 411 case where footprints suddenly stopped. The footprints in the morning frost did not fade away slowly, nor did they show any signs of a struggle or a sudden violent fall. They simply stopped. It was near the edge of a high granite ridge, about 2 miles north of the main trail, in an area of the state forest thick with ancient pine and jagged limestone outcroppings. The search coordinator, a man who had spent 30 years tracking missing persons through these specific mountains, knelt and stared at the final depression in the pale white earth. The left boot print was deep, pressing heavily through the crisp layer of frost and into the damp, dark soil beneath. There was no right boot print to follow it. Beyond that single heavy indentation, there was only a vast, undisturbed sheet of frost covering the flat stone of the ridge. Nothing had brushed against the nearby ferns. No low-hanging branches were broken. It was as if the man had stepped forward with his left foot and simply ceased to be tethered to the ground. The geography of the upper basin was notoriously deceptive, a sprawling network of deep ravines and dense timber that could easily turn a seasoned hiker around. But the missing man was not a tourist. His name was Elias, a local surveyor who knew the topography of the northern ridge better than anyone in the county. He had walked out of his small cabin at 6 o'clock on a Tuesday morning in late October. The air that day had been crisp but clear, the kind of autumn morning that drew locals deep into the woods before the heavy winter snows arrived. He was dressed appropriately for the season in a heavy wool jacket, sturdy leather boots, and carried a small canvas pack with enough supplies to last well through the afternoon. According to the missing person report, Elias had only intended to check a line of remote trail cameras he maintained along the eastern edge of the property line. His wife told the 911 operator that he knew every stone and creek in that section of the woods. He had promised to return by noon for lunch. When 3 o'clock in the afternoon passed with no sign of him, a quiet, creeping unease settled over the house. When dusk arrived, bringing with it a sharp drop in temperature and the deep, total darkness of the mountain valley, that unease turned into a pressing emergency. By midnight, the first official search teams had already assembled at the trailhead with high-powered flashlights, radios, and a team of tracking dogs. The tracking dogs provided the first clear indication that this would not be a standard search and rescue operation. The handlers brought 3 experienced bloodhounds to the front porch of the cabin, allowing them to catch Elias's scent from a worn flannel shirt. Initially, the dogs performed exactly as trained. They pulled eagerly at their long leashes, leading the handlers up the familiar winding incline behind the property. They moved swiftly for the first hour, cutting through the dense, dark timber with absolute purpose, their noses close to the damp earth. But as the search party crossed the lower tree line and entered the shadow of the upper ridge, the behavior of the animals drastically changed. The lead dog suddenly stopped pulling. It lowered its head, sniffing frantically at a single patch of dead, frozen grass, before letting out a low, trembling whine and backing away. Within minutes, all 3 dogs sat rigidly in the cold dirt, refusing to take another step forward. They did not bark at the darkness. They did not circle looking for a lost scent. They simply sat close to their handlers, staring up into the black canopy of the towering pines, shivering violently despite their thick coats. The handlers eventually had to carry the dogs back down the trail, leaving the human volunteers to push forward alone. Witnesses in the search party later claimed that the woods felt entirely dead that night. The wind, which usually howled relentlessly through the narrow canyons of the basin, had dropped to an absolute unnatural standstill. The silence was so profound and heavy that the searchers could hear the blood rushing in their own ears, and the rhythmic squeak of their waterproof gear seemed to echo for miles. Usually, the forest at night was alive with the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, the sharp creak of settling wood, and the distant, lonely call of owls. But on that night, several seasoned rangers reported feeling an immense, suffocating pressure in the air as if they were walking through the interior of a massive soundproof room. Every beam of light sweeping through the trees seemed to stop short, swallowed by an unusual density in the dark. At 3:30 a.m., a team of volunteers sweeping the floor of the lower ravine found the first physical piece of evidence. It was Elias's canvas backpack, sitting perfectly upright on the flat, mossy surface of a large river boulder. It had not been dropped in a panic or thrown aside in a rush. The shoulder straps were neatly arranged, tucked carefully beneath the base of the bag, and all the buckles were securely fastened. Inside, they found his metal water bottle, entirely full, alongside his compass and a spare pair of heavy insulated gloves. The most unsettling detail of the discovery was the placement of his two-way radio. It was resting perfectly balanced on top of the closed backpack. The power switch was turned on, indicating the battery was still alive, but the volume dial had been rotated completely down to zero. It was a bizarre and troubling contradiction. A man lost or injured in the wilderness relies on a radio as his primary lifeline to the outside world. To deliberately silence the device and abandon it so carefully on a rock suggested either a calm, intentional choice to vanish or a state of mind that could no longer comprehend the concept of rescue. As the sun finally rose, casting long, pale, gray shadows across the basin, the trackers located a distinct set of boot prints in the soft mud near the boulder. The tracks clearly belonged to Elias, perfectly matching the heavy, deep-lug tread pattern of his winter boots, but the path they carved through the landscape made no logical sense. Instead of heading back down the gradual slope toward the safety of the valley and the highway, the prints turned away from home. They aimed directly toward the steepest, most unforgiving section of the mountain, a tangled mass of briars and loose scree. According to the lead rescue coordinator, the stride of the footprints was deeply alarming. The distance between the left and right impressions was impossibly wide. The spacing suggested that Elias was either running at a breakneck, desperate speed up a 45-degree incline, or taking massive, leaping bounds through thick underbrush that should have been physically impenetrable. A human being could not maintain that kind of momentum up a mountain face without tripping, stumbling, or leaving signs of broken branches and crushed vegetation. Yet, the tracks were clean, perfectly spaced, and relentless in their upward trajectory. 200 yards further up the punishing incline, the team found another piece of the puzzle, and it only deepened the growing sense of dread. Draped carefully over a low-hanging hemlock branch was Elias's heavy wool winter jacket. It was not torn, snagged, or hastily discarded. It had been meticulously unbuttoned, taken off, and folded neatly over the damp wood. The temperature in the valley had dipped to 28 degrees overnight. Stripping off a primary layer of winter clothing in sub-freezing conditions is a recognized symptom of late-stage hypothermia, a fatal phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing, where a freezing brain falsely signals to the body that it is burning up. Yet, the veteran trackers noted immediately that the timeline for hypothermia simply did not fit the physical evidence. Based on the distance from his cabin, Elias would have reached this specific spot only 2 or 3 hours after leaving home, far too early for the deep, delirious final stages of freezing to set in. Furthermore, the victims of hypothermia walk with a staggering, chaotic gait as their motor functions shut down. Elias's footprints leading away from the abandoned jacket remain straight, deep, and incredibly wide, showing a level of physical power and purpose that directly contradicted the symptoms of a dying man. At 9:15 a.m., the radio operator stationed back at the base camp experienced a highly unusual anomaly. For several uninterrupted minutes, a burst of thick, heavy static broke through the primary search and rescue channel. The operator attempted to clear the frequency, asking for any team in the field to identify themselves and report their status. The static did not break. Instead, it slowly shifted in tone and pitch, forming a rhythmic mechanical pulse that sounded almost like heavy, labored breathing, echoing through miles of empty, hollow pipe. Behind the dense wall of static, faint, metallic clicking sounds began to echo in a slow, deliberate, and entirely unnatural pattern. The transmission lasted for exactly 2 minutes before the channel snapped back to dead, empty silence. The operator immediately radioed all the search teams in the field, Every unit confirmed that their radios were secure and none of them had triggered their microphones. The origin of the signal was never traced, and no other frequencies in the area reported the interference. By 11 o'clock in the morning, the primary tracking team finally reached the high granite ridge. The punishing terrain here leveled out into a barren, wind-swept expanse of pale stone, broken only by thin, shallow patches of frosted soil and dead moss. This was the exact location where they found the final, impossible sequence of footprints. They followed the wide, bounding strides across a shallow depression of dirt that led toward the sudden drop-off of the cliff. The tracks moved in a perfectly straight, unwavering line. The searchers walked parallel to the prints, giving them a wide berth, deeply careful not to disturb the evidence. They counted exactly 12 massive steps across the morning frost. And then there was the 13th step. The left boot drove deep into the soft, yielding earth, crushing a thick layer of dead green moss. The toe of the print was angled slightly forward, deeply embedded, implying a tremendous amount of forward momentum. But there was absolutely no right footprint to follow it. The trackers instantly fanned out, circling the immediate area in a wide 50-foot radius. They shone high-powered flashlights into the narrow, dark crevices of the surrounding rock. They swept the distant tree line, looking for any sign of broken timber. They looked for signs that Elias had jumped to another rock, but the nearest boulder was 30 feet away. They looked for signs of a sudden fall, a dragging rope, or the massive sweeping tracks of a large predator that might have carried a man away. There was nothing to be found. The earth was entirely undisturbed. The delicate crystalline frost on the granite just inches away from that final boot print remained entirely intact, glittering like broken glass under the cold, pale sunlight. The trail simply ceased to exist. As the searchers stood in a circle around the impossible end of the trail, the atmosphere in the upper basin violently shifted. The oppressive, heavy silence of the morning was suddenly broken by a deep, low, humming wind that seemed to vibrate directly through the thick rubber soles of their boots. The sky above the ridge, which had been a clear, piercing, cloudless blue just moments before, darkened with a terrifying and unnatural speed. Thick, bruised gray clouds rolled over the jagged peaks, sealing the valley floor in a sudden, premature twilight. The temperature plummeted 10 degrees in a matter of minutes, chilling the sweat on the necks of the searchers. Small, hard pellets of ice began to fall from the blackening sky, striking the granite ridge with sharp, rhythmic taps that sounded like scattering nails. The lead rescue coordinator knew the brutal protocol for sudden mountain weather. A squall moving this fast in the upper basin could easily trap, freeze, and kill an entire team of experienced men. Reluctantly, with a heavy heart, he keyed his radio and gave the absolute order to abandon the ridge and fall back to the staging area. The men cast one last, long look at the single, final boot print resting alone in the frost before turning away and beginning the dangerous descent. By the time they reached the safety of the lower tree line, the snow was falling in heavy, blinding horizontal sheets. The unseasonal storm locked the mountain down for 3 full days, burying the high ridge under 4 feet of dense, heavy, wet snow. The weather effectively erased the strange trail, destroyed any remaining scent markers, and buried whatever evidence might have been left on the stone. When the deep thaw finally came weeks later, local rangers made one last quiet attempt to search the high areas of the basin. They did not find Elias. They did not find his remains, his missing clothing, or his other boot. They did, however, find one of the remote trail cameras he had gone out into the woods to check on that very first morning. It was strapped tightly to the trunk of an old birch tree about 1 mile south of where his footprints had inexplicably vanished. The plastic outer casing of the camera was deeply cracked, and the battery cover was missing, but the memory card sealed inside the waterproof housing was miraculously still intact. Investigators pulled the memory card and reviewed the digital footage in a locked, windowless room back at the local ranger station. According to the heavily redacted incident report later obtained by researchers, the camera had captured only a single, silent photograph at 2:45 p.m. on the day Elias disappeared. The image was incredibly grainy, shot in poor lighting under the dense, shadowing canopy of the pines. In the extreme foreground of the image, the very edge of Elias's heavy wool jacket was partially visible. It was slightly out of focus and blurred, capturing the exact moment he was walking past the hidden lens. But the true focus of the camera's automated sensor was drawn to the distant background. Deep in the dark, tangled timber, perfectly aligned with the direction Elias was walking, the shapes of the ancient trees appeared strangely distorted and bent. The shadows in the photograph did not match the natural angle of the afternoon sun. Instead, the darkness seemed to pool together into a single, unnatural, towering shape that stood between the trees, appearing to absorb all the ambient light around it. There were no distinct facial features, no reflections of eyes, and no recognizable outline of a natural animal. It was just a profound, empty, towering mass of darkness standing perfectly still among the pines, waiting on the exact path that Elias was walking toward. The case of the missing surveyor remains officially open, filed quietly under unexplained local disappearances. The dense woods surrounding the upper basin were eventually closed to casual hikers, with the state citing dangerously unstable terrain and deeply unpredictable weather patterns as the official reason. But those who have lived in the shadow of the valley for generations still talk quietly about the man who walked up the mountain and simply stepped off the face of the earth. The story has woven itself into the fabric of the local folklore, becoming a whispered warning passed down to young hunters. They say that sometimes, in the absolute dead of winter, when the biting wind completely drops and the ancient trees grow utterly, unnaturally silent, you can still find massive, wide, bounding footprints carved deeply into the fresh snow. Those foolish enough to track them follow the impossible strides for miles, winding through the darkest and most isolated parts of the forest until they finally reach an open clearing or a high, lonely ridge. And there, alone in the freezing, absolute silence, the tracks always stop. A case from 1998 in the Smoky Mountains was never closed. The dark green canvas backpack was found resting perfectly upright on a moss-covered log 7 miles off the designated trail. It was unzipped just enough to let the morning rain gather inside, yet the exterior remained unnaturally clean. There was no mud on the straps, no tear in the fabric from the dense thorns of the surrounding rhododendron thickets. It sat there in the heavy gray fog as if it had been placed by careful, deliberate hands only moments before the search team arrived. But there was no one around. There was only the endless, suffocating silence of the deep woods. The Great Smoky Mountains contain hollows and ravines that rarely see sunlight. In late October of 1998, the fog rolled through these valleys thick enough to swallow a person whole. A 32-year-old hiker traveling alone had walked into this mist 5 days earlier and simply ceased to exist. He had left no itinerary at the ranger station, only a brief note on the dashboard of his sedan parked near the trailhead. The note said he would return by Sunday evening. When Tuesday morning arrived with no sign of him, the search began. At first, the authorities treated it as a routine rescue operation. Hikers wander off the paths often. They twist ankles in the slick rocks, they lose their bearings in the sudden shifts of weather, they hunker down and wait for the flashlights of the search parties. But by the 4th day, the mood among the volunteers had shifted. The tracking dogs, usually reliable even in the damp mountain air, began to behave strangely. They would pull their handlers toward a specific ravine, only to stop dead at the tree line, whine, and refuse to step any further into the brush. The discovery of the backpack on the 5th day was the first concrete piece of evidence. Inside, investigators found a spare wool sweater, a half-empty canteen, a topography map folded perfectly along its creases, and a single roll of 35mm film. There was no food, no compass, and no sleeping bag. The lead ranger noted in his report that the placement of the bag felt wrong. It was perched too precariously on the rotting log. A sudden gust of wind or the brush of a passing animal would have knocked it into the mud. It seemed staged, left behind as a marker for something the search party could not see. That evening, a severe storm grounded the helicopters and forced the search teams back to the staging area. The rain pounded the metal roof of the temporary command center, drowning out the static of the radio equipment. It was a miserable, cold night. Around 2:15 a.m., the radio operator caught a faint transmission on a closed channel used only by the park rangers. It was brief, just a few seconds of an open microphone. According to the official logs, there was no voice on the other end. There was only the rhythmic sound of a shovel striking soft, wet earth. Over and over, with a heavy, exhausted breathing layered underneath, the operator called out, asking for identification, assuming a ranger was out in the storm trying to free a trapped vehicle. The digging sound stopped. For a long moment, there was only the hiss of static. Then, a slow, deliberate click as the transmitter was turned off. The operator logged the event, feeling a sudden chill that he could not explain. The following morning, a specialized tracking team descended into the hollow where the backpack had been found. The rain had washed away most of the forest floor, turning it into a river of brown sludge. Yet, incredibly, they found footprints. They were isolated, appearing abruptly in a patch of soft clay near a swollen creek. But the stride of the prints was unnatural. The distance between the left foot and the right was nearly 6 feet. No human could walk with a stride that wide without running, yet the depth of the impressions suggested a slow, agonizingly heavy walk. The footprints did not trail off. They simply stopped. The final print was sunk deep into the clay, right at the edge of a sheer drop-off that plummeted 70 feet into a gorge of jagged slate. The searchers peered over the edge, expecting to find a broken body at the bottom, but there was nothing. No torn branches, no disturbed rocks, no blood, just the rushing water of the creek far below. A photographer with the search unit took 3 Polaroid pictures of the strange tracks. He placed them in a manila folder, sealing it with standard evidence tape. The folder was handed over to the chief investigator and locked in the evidence safe at the main ranger station that afternoon. The investigation was moving from a rescue mission to something much darker, though no one wanted to say it out loud. 3 days later, 2 local hunters who had joined the search effort reported finding a campsite. It was located an impossible 14 miles deep into the park in a sector of wilderness that was virtually impenetrable due to deadfall and briars. It took an entire afternoon for a ranger team to hack their way through the underbrush to reach the coordinates. What they found defied all logical explanation. A small single-person tent was set up in a small clearing, but it was not on the ground. The tent was suspended nearly 30 feet in the air, wedged tightly into the thick branches of an ancient oak tree. It was perfectly pitched, the nylon pulled taut, the stakes driven deep into the thick, rotting bark of the upper limbs. To assemble a tent with such precision on the ground was standard. To do it suspended 30 feet above the forest floor without ropes or climbing gear was something else entirely. A climber was brought in to scale the oak and inspect the tent. The rest of the team waited below in the silence of the growing dusk. According to the climber's statement, the zipper of the tent was secured from the outside. When he carefully pulled it open, shining his flashlight into the dark nylon cavity, he found it completely empty. But it was not undisturbed. The floor of the suspended tent was covered in a thick layer of crushed, dry autumn leaves, arranged perfectly into the shape of a sleeping human figure. The unnerving discoveries began to take a toll on the search teams. Volunteers stopped showing up, rumors began to circulate in the surrounding towns. Locals spoke of the old legends of the mountains, of things that lived deep in the hollows that could mimic the shapes of the lost. The police officially dismissed these rumors, focusing instead on the tangible evidence gathered so far. But the tangible evidence was about to become a problem. The lead investigator requested the manila folder containing the Polaroid photographs of the bizarre footprints. He unlocked the secure safe at the station, a safe to which only 3 people had the combination. He pulled out the folder. The evidence tape was still perfectly sealed. The signature across the seam was unbroken, but when he cut the tape with his pocket knife and opened the folder, it was empty. The photographs were gone. There was no logical way they could have been removed without tearing the envelope or breaking the seal. Confusion gave way to quiet panic within the precinct. The investigator immediately went to the audio archives to retrieve the cassette tape recording of the strange 2 a.m. radio transmission. He found the labeled plastic case sitting neatly on its designated shelf. He opened it, ready to play the sound of the digging for a newly assigned detective. The case contained a completely blank cassette. The tape had been entirely unspooled and cut out, leaving only the clear plastic reels. Pieces of the case were vanishing. It was as if the mountain itself was reaching into the concrete walls of the station and erasing the proof of what had happened. Paranoia set in among the staff. Accusations of tampering were whispered in the hallways, but no one could explain how or why a deputy would steal a photo of a footprint or a recording of static. The final piece of evidence remained: the single roll of 35mm film found in the abandoned backpack. It had been sent to a secure lab in a neighboring county to be developed, far away from the local station. A week after the search had stalled, a plain envelope arrived on the investigator's desk containing the developed photographs. There were 24 exposures on the roll. The first 22 were completely black. The lab technicians noted that the lens cap must have been on, or the photos were taken in absolute darkness without a flash. But the final 2 photographs contained images. The investigator laid them out on his desk under the harsh fluorescent light of his office. The 23rd photograph was taken in the woods, clearly at night. The harsh glare of the camera flash illuminated a thick wall of briars and twisted rhododendron branches. But slightly off-center, partially obscured by the leaves, was a figure. It was incredibly tall, easily over 7 feet, wrapped entirely in dark, wet canvas. It had no discernible face, just a pale, smooth surface where features should have been. It stood perfectly still among the thorns, facing the camera. The 24th photograph was the most disturbing. It was taken from a low angle, pointing straight up into the canopy of a massive oak tree. The flash caught the underside of a nylon tent suspended high in the branches. But the tent was not empty in this picture. A heavy, dark shape pressed against the thin nylon floor from the inside, bowing the material downward. And hanging by a single strap from a branch just below the tent, swinging slightly in the blurred exposure of the camera, was the hiker's dark green canvas backpack. The investigator stared at the photographs for hours. They contradicted everything the search team had found. The backpack had been discovered miles away from the suspended tent, resting on a log. If the backpack was in the tree when the photo was taken, who had moved it to the log, cleaned it, and left it for the rangers to find, and more importantly, who was operating the camera? He locked the 2 photographs in his desk drawer, intending to drive them to the Federal Bureau the next morning. He locked his office door. He walked out to his car in the quiet, damp evening air, feeling the weight of the dark mountains pressing down on the small town. He did not sleep that night. He listened to the wind rattling the window panes of his house, imagining the sound of a shovel biting into wet earth. When he returned to his office at 7:30 the next morning, his door was still locked. He sat at his desk, drank his coffee, and unlocked the bottom drawer to retrieve the photographs. The drawer was empty, there was no sign of forced entry, the locks had not been picked. The photographs, the final piece of physical evidence connecting the missing hiker to the strange anomalies in the woods, were simply gone. A thorough internal investigation yielded nothing. Polygraphs were administered to the staff, the station was searched from top to bottom, but the evidence was gone, just like the hiker. Without proof, the case grew cold. The search was officially suspended in November. The harsh winter snows covered the Great Smoky Mountains, burying the ravines and the hollows under feet of freezing white drift. By the spring of 1999, the missing man was declared legally dead. The case file was archived in a basement room filled with blank spaces and missing addendums. The official narrative was that a man wandered off the trail, succumbed to the elements, and his remains were likely scavenged by wildlife. It was a clean, logical story that the public could accept. But those who had been in the woods during those 5 days knew the truth was much darker. They remembered the wide, unnatural footprints. They remembered the empty tent suspended in the canopy. And the investigator remembered the pale, featureless face staring through the briars in a photograph that no longer existed. The case was never closed. It remains open, a silent stain on the records of the national park. The missing man's car was eventually towed away, the rust already eating at its edges. The woods reclaimed the paths cleared by the search teams. The ancient oak tree still stands somewhere deep in the hollows, its upper branches thick and twisted. According to local reports, hikers who wander too far off the trail in that specific sector still hear strange things when the fog rolls in. They speak of the sudden, suffocating silence that falls over the forest, a quiet so absolute it makes their ears ring. And occasionally, very late at night, campers claim to hear the rhythmic, distant sound of a shovel striking wet earth, digging a hole that no one will ever find. The Pogo Clown's Crawlspace. The suburbs of Chicago in the 1970s were a portrait of American stability. Neatly paved streets, freshly painted fences, and the quiet assurance that hard work yielded a comfortable life. On Somerdale Avenue in Des Plaines, this ideal was embodied by a successful contractor. He was a precinct captain, a charismatic neighbor who threw lavish summer barbecues, and a man who volunteered his weekends to entertain sick children dressed as Pogo the Clown. But beneath the veneer of civic duty and neighborly warmth, beneath the very floorboards of his sprawling brick ranch house, a suffocating darkness was taking root. It did not begin with a sight or a sound. It began with a smell. At first, the odor was subtle. It was a heavy, damp presence that seemed to cling to the lower edges of the rooms. The contractor's wife would walk through her kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon and catch a faint, sickeningly sweet waft drifting up from the heating vents. It did not smell like common household garbage. It was an oily, thick scent, reminiscent of spoiled meat left too long in the sun, mixed with the chalky, bitter chemical tang of quicklime. It was the kind of smell that coats the back of the throat and settles deep in the lungs. When she questioned him, John Wayne Gacy remained perfectly calm. He did not flinch or grow defensive. With the smooth, reassuring cadence of a seasoned salesman, he offered logical explanations. The house was built on a high water table, he told her. It was simply moisture building up in the dark, unventilated earth of the crawlspace. Or perhaps, he suggested with a casual shrug, a stray cat or a rat had crawled under the foundation during a cold snap and died. To fix it, he hauled dozens of bags of powdered lime into the house, dragging them down the hallway to the small access hatch in the floor. The access hatch was a small, unassuming square of wood that led down into a claustrophobic nightmare. The crawlspace was not a basement. It was a tight, oppressive gap between the floor joists and the raw earth, offering only a few feet of clearance. A man could not stand down there. He had to crouch, dragging himself through the cold, damp mud on his hands and knees. In the absolute darkness of that cramped void, the air was entirely still, thick with the heat of decomposition. Over the years, Gacy descended into this lightless pocket of earth again and again, armed with a short-handled shovel. He carved shallow trenches into the soil, forcing limp, lifeless forms into spaces too small to hold them, folding limbs to make them fit, and burying them under a thick snowfall of corrosive lime. Above ground, the charade of normalcy continued, creating a grotesque juxtaposition that defied comprehension. In the height of summer, usually around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Gacy would host his legendary backyard barbecues. Hundreds of guests would arrive. There were local politicians, distinguished police officers, and successful business owners, all mingling under the warm afternoon sun. They drank cold beer, played horseshoes on the lawn, and laughed at Gacy's loud, boisterous jokes. Is less than hasshone. Zero hash is greater than. Gacy would stand at the large outdoor grill wearing an apron, skillfully flipping burgers and steaks. The rich, savory smoke of cooking meat would billow across the yard, masking the faint, persistent odor rising from the ground below. As the guests stood on the patio, making small talk and enjoying the suburban twilight, they were completely oblivious. They were standing on a graveyard. Just inches below the soles of their expensive shoes, separated only by a thin layer of topsoil and concrete, lay the rotting remains of young men. 29 bodies were packed into the earth beneath the property, slowly dissolving into the mud while the party carried on above them. But as the years passed, the crawl space grew crowded. The earth could no longer absorb the volume of the dead. By 1977, the sickening sweetness in the house became impossible to ignore. In the dead of winter, when the bitter Illinois wind forced the family to close all the windows and turn on the furnace, the horror amplified. The heating system acted as an exhaust pipe for the tomb below. The warm air pushed the concentrated, putrid stench of mass decay up through the floor registers, filling the bedrooms, the living room, and the kitchen with the undeniable smell of death. The scent permeated the furniture. It settled into the fabric of the curtains and the fibers of the carpets. The wife burned candles constantly, leaving windows cracked open despite the freezing temperatures, desperate to scrub the foulness from her home. Gacy brought in industrial deodorizers and fans, complaining loudly about the poor drainage system. He continued to pour hundreds of pounds of lime down the hatch. He maintained his mask of irritation, acting as the frustrated homeowner dealing with a stubborn structural issue. He would put on his clown makeup, paint a wide red smile over his face, and head out to parties, leaving his family to breathe in the exhalations of his victims. The claustrophobia of the house became psychological as well as physical. The air was thick, suffocating, and heavy with an unspoken dread. Neighbors began to notice the strange, pungent odor wafting from the property when the wind blew in a certain direction. They too accepted the story of the broken sump pump and the damp earth. No one wanted to believe that the cheerful man who fixed their sidewalks and hosted their block parties was capable of anything sinister. The human mind naturally rejects the unimaginable, preferring to believe in dead rats rather than murdered boys. The illusion finally collapsed in the freezing final days of 1978. Investigators, looking into the disappearance of a local teenager, executed a search warrant on the house at 8213 Summerdale. When a detective stood in the living room, feeling the warm air blow from a heating vent, the smell hit him. It was a scent no seasoned officer could mistake for a dead animal or a moisture problem. It was the distinct, unmistakable odor of human putrefaction. They pulled up the access panel. A technician lowered himself into the dark, incredibly tight space beneath the house. The heat down there was unnatural, generated by the chemical reaction of the lime and the biological process of dozens of bodies breaking down in the soil. As the technician swept away a thin layer of dirt and white powder, his trowel struck something hard. It was not a pipe, and it was not a stone. It was a human femur. What followed was a slow, agonizing excavation. The crawl space was so heavily packed with remains that investigators struggled to tell where one trench ended and another began. The earth was saturated. The claustrophobia of the site meant officers had to work in agonizingly cramped positions, breathing through heavy masks, carefully removing the victims one by one from the dark mud. They uncovered 29 bodies in that tight, airless void beneath the floorboards, a silent congregation trapped in the dark while the world walked above them. The house was eventually demolished, erased from the manicured landscape of Summerdale Avenue. The lot was left vacant, a patch of empty grass standing in stark contrast to the identical homes surrounding it. But the memory of that suffocating house remains a permanent scar on the neighborhood. For those who lived there, who attended the parties, and who breathed the air in that living room, the horror lingers. It is the realization of how thin the floorboards truly are, and how easily a monster can hide his darkness behind a painted smile and a neighborly wave, burying his secrets in the shallow earth while the rest of the world turns a blind eye. A Dartmoor report described a voice that matched his wife. Exactly. It was 2:15 in the morning when the man stood completely still in his dark kitchen, listening to his wife call for help from the edge of the woods. Her voice was trembling, cutting through the dense fog that rolled off the tree line, begging him to open the back door. The sound was distinct and terrified, carrying the exact pitch and slight rasp she always had when she was frightened. But he did not reach for the deadbolt. He kept his hand pressed flat against the cold wood of the doorframe, his breathing shallow, because he could hear the steady, rhythmic breathing of his actual wife drifting down the stairs from their second-floor bedroom. The property sat at the end of a long, unpaved gravel road in Dartmoor County, a deeply rural stretch of the Pacific Northwest known for its oppressive weather and vast, unbroken tracts of pine forest. According to local records, the area had always struggled with a spotty telephone network and a peculiar acoustic phenomenon. Sound traveled strangely across the damp valleys. A falling tree could sound like a gunshot, and the wind moving through the ravines often mimicked the drone of a low-flying airplane. But the voice filtering through the glass of the kitchen door was not a trick of the wind. It was a precise, flawless replication of a human voice layered with artificial emotion. The man, whose name was detailed in later police reports only as Thomas, remained in the dark. Outside, the pleading continued. The voice repeated the same three phrases in a loop. It asked him to come outside, it said it was cold, it said it had lost the flashlight. Thomas realized with a sinking sickness that these were the exact phrases his wife had used 3 years earlier during a camping trip in another state when she had briefly lost her way near their tent. The cadence was perfectly preserved, like an audio recording pressed into the damp night air. A heavy silence fell over the yard. The voice stopped mid-sentence, cutting off abruptly without any natural fade or intake of breath. Thomas pressed his cheek against the frosted glass of the back window, peering out into the impenetrable blackness. There was no movement near the tree line. The motion sensor light attached to the garage, which was sensitive enough to trigger when a stray deer wandered past, remained completely dark. Yet, he could hear the unmistakable sound of wet leaves compressing under heavy, deliberate footsteps. They were moving closer to the house, but the rhythm was entirely wrong. It sounded like something walking on two legs, but the steps were spaced too far apart, dragging slightly with every second stride. According to the incident report filed days later, Thomas finally backed away from the door and retrieved a heavy steel flashlight from the kitchen counter. He did not turn it on. He moved silently through the first floor, checking the locks on the heavy oak front door and the sliding glass panels in the living room. Every window was secured. As he stood in the center of the living room, surrounded by the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the adjacent room, a new sound began. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping against the glass of the living room window. Thomas froze. The window was located on the side of the house where the ground dropped away into a steep ravine. To reach that glass from the outside, a person would need to be standing on a tall ladder, or they would have to be nearly 9 feet tall. The tapping continued, patient and unhurried. Then the voice returned, but it was no longer screaming, it was whispering right against the external pane of glass. It whispered Thomas's name over and over, mirroring the gentle, sleepy tone his wife used when waking him up in the morning. The history of Dartmoor County is scattered with strange, fragmented reports of auditory anomalies. Archival newspaper clippings from the 1970s describe loggers walking off their job sites, claiming they heard their foreman calling them into deep, unmarked sections of the forest. In 1992, a search and rescue team spent 3 days looking for a missing hiker because they kept hearing his voice echoing from the bottom of a limestone gorge. When they finally found the man, he had been deceased for over 48 hours, making it medically impossible for him to have been shouting for help that morning. These incidents were often rationalized as echo delays or the stress-induced auditory hallucinations of exhausted searchers. But standing in his living room, Thomas knew he was not hallucinating. The whisper against the glass was too tactile, too physically present. The condensation on the outside of the window seemed to blur, disturbed by hot breath. Slowly, Thomas raised the heavy flashlight and clicked the beam on, aiming it directly at the window. The bright circle of light illuminated the swirling fog and the bare branches of an oak tree. There was nothing standing outside the glass. The air was empty. But the whispering did not stop. It simply shifted, the source of the sound moving rapidly along the exterior wall, traveling faster than a human could run. The voice slid along the vinyl siding, moving toward the front porch. Thomas tracked the sound from the inside, his heart pounding a heavy rhythm against his ribs. He heard the wooden planks of the porch groan under a sudden, immense weight. Then came the sound of the front door handle jiggling. It was a violent, frantic rattling, as if someone was desperately trying to force the lock. Thomas raised the flashlight like a weapon, bracing himself. Over the noise of the rattling handle, a new voice spoke. It was deep, panicked, and distinctly male. It was his own voice. The voice outside the door was screaming to let him in. It was a flawless imitation of Thomas shouting for his wife, demanding she unlock the door and call 911. Thomas listened to himself panic. He listened to the exact timbre of his own terror, a terror he was currently feeling but had not yet voiced aloud. The mimicry was so uncanny that for a fleeting, disorienting second, Thomas felt a severe detachment from his own body. He wondered wildly if he was the one trapped outside in the freezing fog, and the thing standing inside the dark hallway was the imposter. Up on the second floor, a floorboard creaked. Thomas snapped out of his paralyzing trance. The noise outside the front door vanished instantly, plunging the house back into suffocating silence. He heard his wife's footsteps moving slowly down the carpeted stairs. She called out his name, her voice thick with sleep and confusion. Thomas immediately warned her to stay back, to stay on the stairs. He kept his flashlight trained on the front door, the solid wood suddenly looking very fragile. She asked him what was going on, why he was standing in the dark. He did not know how to explain that he had just spent 20 minutes listening to both of them beg for their lives from the other side of the walls. They sat together on the floor of the upstairs hallway until dawn, the bedroom door locked, waiting for the sun to burn off the fog. The local police arrived shortly after 8 o'clock in the morning. 2 deputies walked the perimeter of the house while Thomas and his wife watched from the kitchen window. The officers found no signs of forced entry. The locks were intact, the glass was undisturbed, and the motion sensor lights were confirmed to be in perfect working order. However, the official police report noted one peculiar detail that the deputies could not easily dismiss. In the damp soil beneath the living room window, the window that overlooked the steep drop-off into the ravine, there were deep impressions in the mud. They were not footprints, they were long, smooth drag marks, as if something incredibly heavy and completely lacking limbs had pulled itself back and forth beneath the glass. The marks stretched all the way around the foundation of the house, leading up the steps to the front porch, and eventually disappearing into the thick brush at the edge of the tree line. Desperate for proof that they were not losing their grip on reality, Thomas purchased a digital audio recorder from an electronics store 50 miles away. He placed it on the wooden railing of the front porch, wrapped in a plastic bag to protect it from the creeping dampness of the fog. He set it to activate only when it detected a sound louder than a whisper. For 3 nights, the device captured nothing but the low hum of the wind and the occasional patter of freezing rain against the wooden deck. On the 4th morning, the digital display indicated that 42 minutes of audio had been recorded between the hours of 3 a.m. and 4 o'clock in the morning. Thomas and his wife sat at the kitchen table, sunlight streaming through the windows, and pressed play. At first, there was only static, then the distinct crunch of gravel. Something heavy was dragging itself up the driveway. The sound was wet, accompanied by a low, rhythmic wheezing that did not sound remotely biological. Then the voices began. It was not just Thomas and his wife. The recorder had captured a chaotic, layered chorus of conversations. They heard a mail carrier they had spoken to weeks ago asking about a stray dog. They heard a neighbor complaining about a fallen tree. They heard the 911 dispatcher from the night of the first incident repeating her calm, practiced instructions on a loop. The entity outside was practicing. It was sifting through an archive of stolen sounds, testing syllables, adjusting its pitch, searching for the frequency that would compel someone to unlock the door. The most disturbing part of the recording came at the very end. The layered voices abruptly cut out, leaving a hollow, dead silence. Then, a voice spoke directly into the microphone. It was impossibly close, the breathing heavily distorted by the plastic bag. It was the voice of Thomas's wife humming a tuneless, repetitive melody. It was a melody she only ever hummed while she was completely alone, folding laundry in the basement. The entity had been listening to them long before it ever made itself known. The illusion of safety shattered permanently on a Tuesday evening in late November. The sun had set early, casting long, bruised shadows across the yard. Thomas's wife was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, while Thomas was in the basement organizing a set of tools. The basement was unfinished, a cavernous space of exposed concrete and damp earth, lit by a single bulb swinging from a wire. As he sorted through a box of nails, he heard her call down the wooden stairs. She asked him to come up and look at something outside the window. Her voice was calm, casual, lacking any trace of alarm. Thomas dropped a handful of nails back into the box and began walking toward the staircase. He had his foot on the bottom step when his cell phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was a text message from his wife. It read that she had just driven into town to pick up milk from the grocery store and would be back in 20 minutes. Thomas stared at the glowing screen, the cold air of the basement suddenly feeling like ice against his skin. From the top of the dark staircase, the voice spoke again. It repeated the exact same phrase with the exact same casual intonation. It asked him to come up and look at something outside. Thomas did not answer. He slowly backed away from the stairs, retreating into the shadows of the concrete walls. He realized that the voice was not coming from the kitchen. It was coming from the narrow gap beneath the door at the top of the stairs, vibrating through the wood with an unnatural, mechanical precision. He stood in the damp darkness for what felt like hours, gripping a heavy iron wrench in his right hand. Above him, the pacing began. It was not the sound of dragging, but the heavy, deliberate thud of boots walking across the hardwood floor of the kitchen. The footsteps matched Thomas's own gait perfectly. He listened as the entity moved through their home, opening cabinets, running the faucet, mimicking the mundane sounds of a quiet evening. It was playing house. It was wearing their routine like a stolen piece of clothing. When the headlights of his wife's car finally swept across the driveway, the footsteps above him abruptly stopped. Thomas heard the front door open, heard his wife calling out a greeting, the rustle of paper grocery bags being set on the counter. He waited for another voice to answer her. He waited for a scream, but there was only silence, followed by her footsteps